The preservation of analog decay is a lonely business. For 5 years, I operated my archiving service out of a damp, windowless basement apartment in the city, surrounded by the physical detritus of the late 20th century. To the casual observer, my workshop was a graveyard of obsolete technology, towering racks of professional-grade Sony Betacam SP decks, high-end Panasonic SV chess machines with thermal tracking, and a massive, heavy JVC cathode ray 2 monitor that gave off a distinct, high-pitched whine whenever it warmed up. People brought me their pasts in cardboard boxes. They brought me faded wedding videos recorded on cheap Scotch cassettes, grainy footage of birthday parties from the early 90s, and unedited industrial training tapes from long-defunct manufacturing plants. My job was simple: convert the magnetic tape into digital files, clean up the audio hiss, and burn the result onto a hard drive. It was mechanical, repetitive work, but it suited me. I liked the predictable, linear nature of magnetic tape. I liked the heavy, physical clack of a cassette loading into the transport mechanism, and the rhythmic, reassuring hum of the spinning video heads drawing the tape across the audio track. But on the morning of May 3rd, the routine broke. I found the cassette slipped through the brass mail slot of my basement door. There was no shipping envelope, no return address, and no note from a client. It was just a plain, unbranded VHS tape housed in a heavy black cardboard sleeve that was completely blank. The plastic of the cassette casing felt unnaturally cold, as if it had been sitting in a freezer overnight, and the long window that exposed the dark ribbon of magnetic tape was clouded with a thin, greasy layer of condensation. I picked it up, my fingers immediately tingling with a strange, static-like numbness. On the spine of the cassette, someone had applied a single strip of yellowed masking tape with 3 words written in crude, hand-painted black ink. Chernobyl, April 1986. I frowned, the air in my lungs suddenly feeling thin. My family had fled the northern territories shortly after the disaster, leaving behind a small, dark-timbered house on the edge of a nameless village just outside the exclusion zone. My father had never spoken of that spring. He had spent the rest of his life in the city, silent and distant, his eyes always scanning the horizon as if he expected the trees to begin moving. I carried the cassette to my workstation. I slid the tape into the Panasonic SV chess deck. The machine let out a deep, mechanical clunk as the loading arms engaged the magnetic ribbon. I hit play. For the first 30 seconds, the screen showed only the familiar, dancing gray and white static of an unrecorded signal. But the audio track wasn't silent. Beneath the high-pitched hiss of the tape head, there was a sound, a low, rhythmic, mechanical thumping that sounded like a massive wooden piston operating deep underground. Thump, thump, thump. I reached out and turned the volume dial up. The sound didn't just get louder, it got deeper, vibrating the heavy oak table and making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. And then the static snapped into a sharp, clear image. The footage was in color, but the hues were distorted, saturated with a sickly, yellowish tint that made the sky look like a bruised lawn. The timestamp at the bottom right corner of the screen read, April 21st, 1986, 3:17 a.m. The camera was positioned at the edge of a dense, dark pine forest. In the distance, rising above the jagged tree-line, the concrete silhouette of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant stood dark and silent against the pale morning light. There was no smoke yet, no fire, no indication of the catastrophe that would unfold just 5 days later. But the forest was wrong. The trees were too still. Even though the wind was whipping through the tall, dry grass in the foreground, the towering pines did not move. Their branches were locked in place, their needles thick and dark like the rusted needles of a sewing machine. Suddenly, the camera panned downward, focusing on a narrow dirt path that led into the heart of the woods. Standing in the center of the path was a figure. It was impossibly tall, at least 9 feet high. Its thin, dark limbs bending at unnatural, sharp angles as it stood perfectly motionless against the trees. It had no face, only a smooth, pale mass of wood-like tissue that seemed to absorb the sickly light from the sky. It wore a heavy, dark coat that was buttoned tightly up to its chin, and its long, multi-jointed fingers were curled around the trunk of a dead pine. Entry 438. A voice whispered through the monitor speaker. It didn't come from a human throat. It was a flat, clinical, and completely mechanical transmission, a perfect mimicry of my own voice, using the exact same tone and cadence I used when I recorded my archiving notes. The archivist has loaded the tape. The voice rattled, the sound vibrating the glass of the CRT screen. He thinks he is looking at the history of the zone. He doesn't know that the tape doesn't record the past. The tape records what is waiting for him behind the lath and plaster. I scramble backward, my boots clicking loudly against the bare concrete floor of my workshop. My hand hovered over the stop button on the VCR deck, but my fingers were frozen, paralyzed by the sudden, biting cold that had filled the basement room. My breath turned into thin, white clouds that drifted toward the monitor. "Do not stop the tape, Mark," the voice from the speaker said, its tone suddenly shifting. It was no longer using my voice. It was using my father's voice, clear, deep, and carrying that familiar, dry rattle that I hadn't heard since his funeral 6 years ago. "If you break the circuit before the tape is finished, the signal won't have anywhere else to go. It will look for the rot in your foundation, Mark. It will look for the gaps where the salt washed away." The camera on the screen panned again, moving away from the tall figure in the woods and focusing on a small, dark timbered cottage at the edge of the village. It was my childhood home. The high wooden fence that surrounded the yard was reinforced with thick iron plates, and the heavy gate was held shut by 3 massive iron padlocks. But through the narrow cracks in the wood, I could see someone looking out toward the camera. It was a young boy. He was sitting on the porch steps, holding a small, rusted coffee tin in his hands, his face pale with terror. It was me. Entry 439, the puppet-like voice of the speaker continued, the sound now changing into a chaotic, overlapping chorus of everyone who had ever lived in my village. "The transmission is clearing, Mark. The circuit is closing. To see the whole picture, the archivist must look behind the screen." I didn't turn off the VCR. Using my memory of the workshop's layout, I stepped behind the heavy steel table, my boots crunching on a fine, white dust that was suddenly falling from the ceiling beams. I reached out and pulled the heavy JVC monitor away from the wall, exposing the dark, unpainted lath and plaster behind it. The masonry was gone. Behind the workstation, embedded directly into the wall of my basement apartment, was a small, perfectly circular window pane of antique glass, held in place by dark, scarred lead casing. It didn't look out into the city streets or the damp alleyway. It showed the dark, silent pine forest from the 1986 broadcast, and standing right behind the glass, its blank wood-like face pressed directly against the pane, was the tall figure. Its long, multi-jointed fingers were resting against the glass, moving in a slow, rhythmic beat. "Top, top, top." It was writing a word in the fog of its own breath, reversed so I could read it from the dark of my workshop. "Record." The breath that fogged the antique glass did not fade. The single word, "record," remained etched into the condensation, its letters sharp and precise, while the swirling mass of black static behind the creature's blank face continued to pulse in time with a mechanical thumping in the room. Thump, thump, thump. My hands were locked onto the sides of the heavy CRT monitor, my fingers frozen by the sudden, intense cold that was bleeding through the lead casing of the circular window. I didn't dare pull the monitor back into place, nor could I look away from the towering, pale silhouette that stood on the other side of the glass, just inches from my face. The dark pine forest behind the figure was exactly as it had appeared on the television screen. Silent, frozen, and bathed in that sickly, yellowish 1986 light. But it wasn't a flat recording anymore. I could see the depth of the trees, the subtle movement of the dark needles that didn't sway with the wind, and the fine, white dust, ash or salt, that covered the dry grass at the creature's feet. Entry 440. The voice rattled from the baseboard behind my heels. It was my father's voice again. It didn't sound like a memory. It was the sound of a man speaking through a direct, low-frequency transmission, his words vibrating the concrete floor beneath my boots. The boy's looking through the lens, Mark. He has the iron in his hands, but he doesn't know how to complete the circuit. Tell him to look at the tracking dial. Tell him that the tape is already moving past the fence. I forced my fingers to release the metal casing of the monitor. I backed away, my boots clicking against the floorboards as I returned to the front of the workstation. My eyes darted to the Panasonic SV chest deck. The digital counter on the front panel was spinning rapidly, but it wasn't counting forward. The numbers were reversing, the red digits flickering through times and dates that didn't make sense. April 25th, 1986. April 12th, 1986. March 4th, 1986. The machine was rewinding the tape on its own, the loading arms groaning under the strain of the high-speed reverse. And then, the counter suddenly stopped. Midnight. The screen of the JVC monitor flickered violently, the static snapping into a new image. The camera was no longer at the edge of the forest. It was inside the dark timbered cottage of my childhood. The room was illuminated only by the faint, orange glow of a single candle sitting on a low wooden stool. I recognized the floral patterned wallpaper, the heavy woven rug on the floor, and the narrow, iron-bound door that led to the cellar beneath the stairs. Sitting on the horsehair sofa in the corner of the room was my father. He was younger, his dark hair free of the gray that had dominated his later years. But his face was gaunt, his eyes wide with a frantic, unblinking terror. He held a thick, leather-bound journal in his lap, his fingers tracing the spidery, handwritten lines of ink on the yellowed pages. "We can't keep the salt dry. Elena," my father whispered on the screen, his voice coming through the monitor's single speaker with a dry, metallic rattle. He was looking towards someone who was standing just off camera. "The rain has been falling for 3 days, and the roots are already in the well." I can hear the tall one tapping against the shutters. He's using Mark's voice. He's asking if the gate is locked. "The gate is locked, Silas," a woman's voice replied from the shadows. It was my grandmother. Her voice was sharp, dry, and filled with a cold, absolute resolve. "But the lock isn't made of iron anymore. It's made of the boy's memory. As long as he remembers the shape of the fence, the circuit remains closed. But if he goes to the city, if he forgets the names in the dark, the anchor will lift." The camera panned down, focusing on the floorboards beneath the horsehair sofa. The wood was wet. A thick, yellowish sap was oozing up from the gaps between the planks, steaming slightly in the freezing air of the room. And then, from the walls of my basement workshop, came the same sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound didn't come from the television. It was directly behind me, moving within the damp, unpainted lath and plaster of my apartment. I watched in absolute horror as a pale, thin line moved beneath the wallpaper, twisting and elongating like a root moving under skin. It traveled down the corner of the room, stopped at the baseboard, and then began to follow the edge of the concrete floor toward my desk. Entry 441. The creature's voice boomed from the speaker, the chaotic, overlapping storm of dozens of voices speaking in perfect, mechanical unison. The anchor is failing. The memory is fading. The boy has spent 12 years trying to forget the village, but the forest doesn't forget its timber. To keep the lens clear, the archivist must offer the first line of the ledger. I look toward the desk. The small, rusted coffee tin I had found in my grandmother's house years ago was sitting next to the VCR deck. It was packed with the remaining coarse rock salt and dark iron shavings I had kept as a memento of the old village. I reached out and grabbed the tin, my knuckles turning white against the rusted metal. The root on the floor was growing thicker, its tip covered in tiny, twitching fibers that were reaching toward the heat of my body. It was moving with a slow, deliberate purpose, drawing a dark, wet line of sulfur-smelling sap across the concrete. I opened the tin and threw a handful of the salt and iron dust directly onto the root. The moment the salt made contact with the wet wood, the tendril let out a high-pitched metallic squeal, a sound that vibrated the fillings in my teeth. It recoiled instantly, curling backward into the wall like a worm on a hot iron stove. But the house above me didn't remain silent. From the ceiling of my basement apartment, just a few feet above my head, came the sound of dragging, irregular footsteps. Thud, thud, thud. Something was pacing the floorboards of the ground floor hallway above my room. It moved with long, heavy strides that made the light fixture in my ceiling sway on its cord. Mark! The voice didn't come from the speaker. It came from directly outside my basement door, muffled only by the 2-inch thick oak planks. It was my mother's voice. She sounded terrified, her breath coming in short, sobbing gasps. Mark, please open the door, she pleaded. The car broke down on the road. Something was following me through the trees. It's so tall, Mark. It's standing right by the fence. Please let me in. I stood frozen in the center of my workshop, the coffee tin clutched to my chest. My mother had been buried 6 years ago. She had never been to this city, and she hadn't spoken to my father since the spring of '86. Mark? The voice outside said again, its tone suddenly dropping, losing its frantic edge. It sounded flatter now, more mechanical. Are you there? Open the door. The wood is thin here. I can feel your pulse through the keyhole. I backed away toward the rear of the workshop, my eyes never leaving the heavy oak door of the apartment. Through the narrow cracks in the door frame, I saw a shadow cross the faint light filtering from the hallway. It was a massive silhouette, far too tall for a normal person. It loomed over the top of the frame, its head bent at a sharp angle to fit under the ceiling. The VCR on the table let out a sudden, violent screech. The tape was no longer rewinding. It was recording. The red light on the Panasonic deck was flashing, and the image on the JVC monitor changed one last time. The screen was no longer showing the old village cottage. It was showing my basement workshop. It was showing the heavy steel table, the stacks of cassettes, and me, standing near the back wall with a rusted coffee tin in my hands. And standing directly behind me on the screen, its pale, branch-like arms reached out to touch my shoulders, was the tall, faceless figure. Entry 442, my own voice whispered from the monitor's speaker. The archivist is in the frame now. The circuit is complete. The lens is ready to turn. The air in the basement workshop froze instantly. The image on the CRT monitor didn't flicker. It held its focus with terrifying clarity. On the screen, the pale, branch-like fingers of the tall one were just millimeters away from my shoulders. Yet, when I whirled around, my back striking the cold, unpainted lath and plaster of the wall, there was nothing there. Just the empty space of my room, the heavy steel table, and the dim, yellow glow of the ceiling lamp. But the phantom weight was real. My shoulders felt heavy, pressed down by an icy, static-like pressure that made my breath hitch in my throat. I looked down at my hands. The skin of my knuckles had turned a pale, sickly blue, the veins standing out dark and rigid beneath the surface. Entry 443. The voice rattled from the Panasonic VCR deck. It was my grandmother's voice now, dry, brittle, and clinical. It didn't sound like it was coming from the machine speaker. It was coming from the internal gears, the sound vibrating the metal casing of the deck, as if her vocal cords were laced through the loading mechanism. "The archivist has crossed the timeline," she said, her tone devoid of any familial warmth. "He has brought the 1986 signal into the 2026 ground. He thinks he's safe because he's far from the exclusion zone. He doesn't know that the exclusion zone isn't a place. It's a radius that follows the blood." I looked back at the circular window embedded in the wall. The glass pane was vibrating so violently that the dark, scarred lead casing surrounding it was beginning to crack. Small flakes of dried, gray mortar were raining down onto my workbench, mixing with the fine, white dust that continued to fall from the ceiling beams. Through the frosted circle, the tall, pale figure was no longer just standing. It was leaning forward, its blank, wood-like forehead pressed directly against the center of the glass. Behind the pane, the swirling black static was spinning in a tight, violent vortex. I could see the dark, frozen needles of the pine trees on the other side, but they were no longer still. They were extending, their jagged tips pushing against the interior of the glass, as if trying to find a seam in the lead. Crack! A thin, hairline fracture appeared across the center of the antique glass. A sudden, sharp draft of freezing, ozone-laden air hissed through the opening, carrying the distinct, bitter scent of boiling sulfur and wet copper. It struck my face like a slap. "Silas," a voice whispered through the crack in the glass. It was my mother's voice again, but it was being pulled through the static, the syllables elongated and distorted like a tape being dragged by a dying motor. The iron is so heavy. Mark has the coffee tin. Tell him to lift the floorboards." I didn't answer. I clutched the rusted coffee tin closer to my chest, my mind racing through the fragments of my father's old journal. "To stop the transmission, you must break the circuit in the ground. The forest doesn't just use the walls, it uses the earth. It uses the foundations that were laid without the salt." I looked down at the concrete floor of my basement. My apartment was old, built in the early years of the century on top of the original stone cellar of a merchant's house. In the corner, half hidden beneath a stack of empty cardboard boxes, was a heavy iron drainage grate that led down into the old sewer system. The concrete surrounding the grate was damp. I walked over to the stack of boxes, kicking them aside with my boots. The iron grate was rusted, its narrow slats choked with decades of dust, dead leaves, and something else, a thick, yellowish viscous sap that was oozing upward from the dark pit below. The thumping in the walls was returning, louder now, coming from the very bottom of the drainage pipe. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a massive, wet lung, drawing air from the basement and exhaling the scent of old, stagnant swamp water into the room. Entry 444, my own voice boomed from the JVC monitor speaker. The image on the screen was still recording my every move, but the background was changing. The steel table was gone. The racks of SV chess machines were gone. In the reflection of the CRT screen, I was standing in the middle of the dark timbered cottage from 1986, surrounded by walls that were weeping sap. "The archivist is looking at the drain," the voice said. "He thinks the iron of the grate will hold the roots back. He doesn't know that the roots have already used the pipes to reach the river. The circuit is already closed, Mark. The whole city is sitting on top of the forest. A thick, dark root, as wide as a man's wrist, burst upward through the iron slats of the drain. It didn't move toward me. It wrapped itself around the edge of the grate, its fibers locking into the rusted metal with a sickening, vet crunch, and then another root emerged, and another. Within seconds, the iron grate was completely obscured by a twisting, pulsing knot of pale, gray wood. It was expanding, its branch-like fingers reaching across the concrete floor toward the legs of my workstation table. "Stop it!" I whispered, my voice shaking as I opened the rusted coffee tin once more. I took a heavy handful of the coarse rock salt and dark iron shavings and threw it directly onto the pulsing mass of roots. The moment the mixture hit the wet wood, the cellar let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek that sounded like a heavy train car braking on a rusted track. The roots thrashed violently, the gray fibers turning into a fine, white ash that drifted upward into the air. But the victory was momentary. From the ceiling above me, the dragging steps stopped, and then came the sound of the wood splitting. Directly above my head, the heavy plaster ceiling of the basement began to crack. A long, jagged line split the ceiling from the door to the workstation, and a thick drop of that yellowish, sulfur-smelling sap dripped down, landing on my shoulder with a soft splat. The cold went through my coat like a knife. "Mark," the voice whispered from the crack in the plaster. It was my father's voice, but it was coming from inside my own head now, vibrating my skull with a low-frequency hum. "The ceiling is just wood, Mark. The floor is just dirt. Your grandmother spent 15 years keeping the fence closed, but she's gone now. You can't keep the trees out with a rusted tin." I backed away toward the circular window, my boots slipping on the fine, white ash that covered the floor. The crack in the antique glass was widening. The black static behind the pane was no longer swirling. It was pressing against the glass, pushing the jagged edges outward until a small piece of the antique lens snapped off, falling onto the floor with a sharp clink. The tall, pale figure didn't move, but its toothless, hooked mouth began to open. "Entry 445, it said, its voice a perfect, crystalline mimicry of my mother's softest whisper. "The new anchor is ready. The old signal has found its home. Come behind glass, Mark. Let us show you what your father left in the woods." I looked down at the coffee tin. There was only one handful of salt left. One small, fragile line of defense against the thing that had followed my family across 40 years of silence. I didn't throw it at the drain. I didn't throw it at the ceiling. I reached out and rubbed the wet, iron-dusted mixture directly onto the dark, scarred lead casing of the window frame, sealing the crack with my own blood where the jagged metal had cut my fingers. The window let out a terrible, vibrating groan that shook the stones in the wall. The eye, the swirling black mass behind the pane, constricted in pure, silent rage. But the ceiling above me didn't stop cracking. The heavy, dark timbers were buckling, and the floorboards of the ground floor were beginning to tilt downward into the room. The night was only half over, and the tape was still recording. The damp concrete of the basement floor felt as though it were breathing. Every time the heavy timbers above my head groaned, a small cloud of the fine, white ash rose from the cracks in the floorboards, swirling around my boots like dry snow. The salt and iron mixture I had smeared onto the window's lead casing was sizzling. The dark, scarred metal was turning a bright, oxidized green, weeping a thin, watery fluid that smelled faintly of vinegar and burnt hair. Behind the crack in the glass, the creature's face remained frozen. Its blank, wood-like forehead was pressed hard against the pane, but the swirling black static within its circular eye sockets had slowed down, turning into a thick, sluggish sludge that looked like boiling tar. Entry 446, a voice muttered from the corner of the room. It was the flat, clinical voice of the digital archivist, my own voice, but distorted by a heavy layer of tape hiss. It didn't come from the JVC monitor. It was coming from empty cardboard boxes I had pushed aside earlier, the sound muffled by the dry paper. The subject has applied the compound to the frame. The seal is temporarily holding, but the internal tracking is misaligned. He doesn't know that the signal isn't coming through the window. The window is just the display. The tape in the deck is the driver. I whirled around, my eyes fixing on the Panasonic SVHS machine. The red recording light was no longer flashing. It was solid, glowing with a bright, angry intensity that cast long, needle-like shadows across the metal surface of the desk. The plastic casing of the VCR was so hot that the white lettering above the buttons was beginning to melt, the ink dripping down the front panel like milk. The magnetic tape inside the cassette was spinning at a speed that the motor was never designed to handle. I could hear the high-pitched, metallic scream of the tape head as it carved its way through the dark ribbon. Screech, screech. On the CRT screen, the image of my basement workshop was gone. It had been replaced by a view from inside the dark timbered cottage of my childhood. But the perspective was different now. The camera was sitting on the floorboards, right next to the open cellar door. Looking down into the pit was my father. He was older now, the skin on his face hanging in loose, gray folds, his fingers curled tightly around the edge of the trapdoor. He was crying, silently, his shoulders shaking with a profound, exhausting grief. "I can't keep him out, Silas," my grandmother's voice whispered from the monitor speaker. She sounded incredibly old, her breath rattling like dry leaves in a gutter. "The boy has gone to the city. He's forgotten the names of the trees. He's forgotten the 7 parts of the fence. The forest is already in the well, and the water tastes like iron." "He had to go, Elena," my father replied, his voice breaking into a wet, heavy cough. "There's nothing left for him here but the ash. I'll go down to the cellar. I'll take the ledger with me. As long as the record stays below the frost line, the tall one can't cross the border." "You're not wood yet, Silas," she said, her voice fading into the crackle of the static. "But you'll be by the time the tape stops." The camera panned down into the darkness of the cellar. It was exactly like the cellar in my apartment, a narrow, stone-walled pit filled with a thick layer of coarse salt and fine iron shavings. But sitting in the center of the pit was a high-backed Victorian armchair made of dark, water-stained walnut. And resting on the armrests were 2 long, pale objects. They looked like human arms, but they were too thin, their skin covered in a fine, dark fuzz that twitched in the cold draft. "Entry 447. My father's voice boomed from the walls of my basement, his tone suddenly losing its grief and turning completely mechanical. "The time is half gone, Mark. The lath is thin here. The wood is turning into skin. If you don't go to the drain, the whole house will fall." The ceiling gave way with a sound like a small explosion. A massive, pale limb crashed through the plaster directly above the horsehair sofa. It didn't look like a branch anymore. It looked like a leg, a 9-foot, multi-jointed appendage made of twisted bone and pale wood, its skin the color of lard. It slammed into the floorboards, its long fingers reaching out for my desk. I scrambled back, my heel catching on the rusted coffee tin. I fell hard against the wall, my shoulder striking the cold masonry just below the circular window. The air was so thick with the white ash that I couldn't see the door. I was coughing, my throat burning as the dry, alkaline dust coated my tongue. "Go down, Mark," my mother's voice pleaded from the crack in the ceiling. She sounded so close now, as if she were standing right above me, leaning down through the broken plaster. "The drain is still cold. The iron is still there. Go down before he looks down from the ceiling." I looked at the heavy iron drainage grate in the corner. The pulsing knot of pale roots had stopped growing, but the gray fibers were twitching, their tips covered in tiny, clear droplets of that yellowish, sulfur-smelling sap. The concrete surrounding the drain was cracking, the gray stone turning into a soft, dark muck that smelled of deep earth and old graves. I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping on the ash, and lunged toward the drain. I didn't have any salt left. My fingers were empty, the skin on my palms torn and bleeding from the jagged edges of the window frame. I gripped the heavy iron slats with both hands. The moment my skin touched the frozen metal, a wave of profound, electrical cold shot up my arms, turning the breath in my lungs into ice. My fingers felt like they were being welded to the iron. "Pull, Mark," the voice from the wall shrieked, the collective voice of everyone who had ever lived in my village, 100 broken throats speaking in unison. Pull the grate and complete the circuit. I gritted my teeth, planting my boots in the dark muck, and lifted. Crack! The iron grate popped out of the concrete floor with a sound like a thunderclap. Beneath it was not a sewer pipe. It was a yawning, pitch-black pit that smelled of ozone and boiling sap. The true heart of the forest, waiting miles below the city. And from the darkness of the stairs behind my basement door, a wet, dragging step began to move downward. The tall one had heard the seal break. It was coming down to the pit. The freezing dark that erupted from the open drain was physically heavy. It smelled of stagnant water, ancient pines, and wet earth that had never seen the sun. My fingers, welded by the cold to the heavy iron grate, throbbed with a burning, static-like numbness. I fell backward onto the ash-covered concrete, dragging the rusted iron slats with me. The moment the drain was completely uncovered, the high-pitched, metallic scream of the VCR deck in my workshop stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I lay there on the ground, my breath escaping my lungs in short, ragged plumes of white mist. I looked toward the workstation. The Panasonic SV chess machine was no longer glowing red. The plastic casing had cooled down, but the front panel was warped, the dark plastic sagging over the cassette slot like melted wax. On the JVC monitor, the image had changed again. It was no longer showing the cottage or the workshop. It was showing a live broadcast of the circular window in my wall, viewed from the outside from the dark, frozen pine forest of 1986. Through the glass of the monitor, I could see my own face looking back out into the trees. My eyes were wide with terror, my skin pale beneath the soot and white ash. And standing directly behind me, in the reflection, was the tall, faceless figure. Entry 448. A voice whispered from the darkness of the open drain at my feet. It was my father's voice, but it was hollow, devoid of any breath. The archivist has opened the lower circuit. He has lifted the iron. He doesn't know that the forest isn't below him. The forest is the very skin of the room. I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping on the wet concrete. The wall behind the workstation was cracking. The small, circular window pane of antique glass was bulging outward, the dark lead casing snapping with a series of high-pitched, metallic sounds like tiny gunshots. The tall, pale figure on the other side of the glass pressed its hand against the fracture. Its long, multi-jointed fingers, covered in the fine, dark fuzz like weed roots, squeezed through the narrow opening I had sealed earlier with the salt. The green, oxidized crust of the iron mixture flaked off, turning into dust. "Mark," the creature whispered, the voice shifting effortlessly into my mother's soft, comforting cadence. "The wood is too thin here. Your father's hands are tired. He's been holding the frame since the spring of '86. Just let the glass break. Let the air from the woods come in." I looked down at the iron grate in my hands. The metal was freezing, covered in a thin, pale layer of frost that didn't melt against my skin. "You're not them," I said, my voice cracking, the words tasting like copper and ash. "The village is dead. The forest burned." "The forest doesn't burn, Mark," the puppet-like voice replied from the walls. This time, It was a chorus of 100 whispers, moving in unison through the lath and plaster. The forest only waits for the signal to clear, and the signal is finally strong. The floorboards above me gave a sickening, wet crunch. The massive, 9-foot pale limb that had crashed through the ceiling earlier retracted, pulling a heavy chunk of the ceiling joist with it. Through the gaping hole in the plaster, I could see the dark, windowless interior of the ground floor. It wasn't an apartment anymore. It was a dense, tangled web of gray roots that stretched into the absolute darkness above. Entry 449. The voice of Dr. Eris rattled from the warped casing of the VCR deck. The time is almost gone. The counter is approaching its limit. To stop the tracking, the archivist must offer the source. The source. I looked at the Panasonic deck. The dark magnetic ribbon of the cassette was still exposed behind a warped casing, its surface covered in a thin, greasy film of sap. It was the only thing that held the memory of the old village, the only anchor that allowed the 1986 signal to broadcast into the present. I threw the iron grate down onto the concrete floor. I stepped toward the workstation, my boots crunching on the glass fragments that had fallen from the window. I reached out toward the VCR, my hands hovering over the melted plastic of the cassette slot. The machine was freezing cold now. "Don't touch it, Mark," my father's voice pleaded from the monitor, sounding frantic, his words breaking through the heavy static. "If you pull the tape, the signal will have nowhere else to land. It will use your marrow as the new ribbon. It will write the names of the trees directly into your bones. Then let it write." I whispered. I drove my bare fingers into the melted slot of the SV chess machine. The sharp, jagged plastic cut into my knuckles, but I didn't let go. I clamped my hand around the ice-cold casing of the VHS tape and pulled. Crack! The loading arms inside the deck snapped with a sound like breaking teeth. The dark ribbon of magnetic tape ripped out of the machine, trailing across the steel table like a dying black serpent. The moment the tape was severed, the JVC monitor let out a high-pitched, electrical shriek. The screen exploded into a violent, blinding wave of blue light that filled the basement. The swirling black static rushed out from the broken CRT screen, turning the white ash in the air into a thick, swirling vortex that pulled everything toward the open drain. I fell forward, my knees striking the concrete as the darkness rushed in. The explosion of blue light didn't make a sound. It was a silent, violent pulse of raw, electromagnetic force that slammed into my chest, knocking me flat onto the concrete floor. I lay there, pinned by the crushing pressure, my face pressed against the cold muck of the open drain. The air in the basement was no longer just freezing. It was completely dead. The high-pitched whine of the CRT monitor had ceased. The mechanical thumping in the walls had stopped. There was only the sound of my own ragged, wet breath rattling in my throat. I opened my eyes, coughing as the fine, white ash coated my lungs. The basement was pitch black, illuminated only by a faint, ghostly luminescence radiating from the severed ribbon of magnetic tape that lay scattered across the concrete. The dark plastic ribbon was twisting and coiling like a dying worm, its glossy surface smoking as the yellowish sap that had soaked it began to boil and turn into ash. Entry 450. A voice whispered from the darkness right beside my ear. It was my own voice, but it was incredibly faint, sounding as if it were being played back from the very bottom of a deep, flooded well. "The ribbon is broken. The circuit is open. The signal has nowhere left to go." I pushed myself up on my hands and knees, my skin tearing against the sharp fragments of glass on the floor. I pulled my phone from my pocket. To my surprise, the screen flickered to life. The battery was at 1%. the clock on the display reading exactly 3:17 a.m. I turned on a flashlight beam and pointed it toward the back wall. The small, circular window pane of antique glass was gone. The dark, scarred lead casing was completely empty, leaving a perfectly round 6-inch hole in the masonry of my basement. I crawled toward it, my boots clicking against the bare concrete. I stood up on my trembling legs and looked through the hole. There was no forest. There was number 1986 morning sky. There was only the dark, damp brickwork of the old merchant cellar next door, and the faint, distant sound of the city's morning traffic beginning to stir 4 floors above my head. The connection had been severed. I turned the flashlight beam toward the workstation. The JVC monitor was a shattered ruin of dark glass and twisted metal, its interior tubes smoking in the cold air. The Panasonic SV chest deck was completely crushed, its iron transport mechanism bent in half like a piece of tin. And lying in the center of the warped casing was the black plastic shell of the Forgotten VHS tape. The magnetic ribbon had been entirely consumed. All that remained inside the cassette windows was a fine, white powder, the same ash that covered the floorboards of the old cottage, the same ash that had buried my childhood village 40 years ago. 2 months later, I don't archive analog tape anymore. I sold the Betacam decks, the high-end Panasonic machines, and the remaining racks of vintage equipment to a media salvage company for pennies. I moved out of the basement apartment and took a job at a local construction firm, operating a heavy excavator. I like the loud, grinding noise of the diesel engine. I like the physical, undeniable reality of the earth being moved by steel. I like things that can be buried deep enough that the air can never reach them. But I kept the empty black casing of that unbranded VHS tape. It sits in a heavy, steel-headed lockbox beneath the floorboards of my new apartment, buried under a 2-inch layer of coarse rock salt and dark iron shavings. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, when the city is asleep and the rain is tapping against my window, I pull the box out. I don't open the lid. I just press my palm against the cold metal casing and listen. And if the room is completely silent, I can hear a faint, high-pitched hiss coming from inside the steel box. It isn't the sound of the wind. It isn't the sound of the rain. It's the sound of a voice, flat, clinical, and entirely alone, whispering from the dark of the magnetic dust. Entry 451. It says, the sound vibrating the steel of the box. The tape is blank. The lens is closed. But the marrow remembers the timestamp.